According to Sperber and Wilson, human communication is so effective because we are capable of attributing certain intentions and beliefs and attitudes to others. And this ability is what Sperber and Wilson call the meta-representational capacity of human beings. And today we'll discuss the notion of meta-representation as it is viewed and interpreted in relevant theoretic analysis. Meta-representation is not a new concept. You can come across various definitions in different branches of science. So here we'll start with a psychological approach, and within that approach meta-representation is defined as mind reading, that is, the ability to form thoughts about attributed thoughts. So the ball is in the box is just a representation, but then this representation can be embedded under John thinks the ball is in the box. That is, you can attribute to John a particular thought. John thinks the ball is not in the box, so here we may say that it is even more difficult to attribute to John the negation of a particular thought. Or a still higher level of meta-representation, John thinks, Sue thinks the ball is or is not in the box. So we can provide a definition that a meta-representation is a representation of a representation, a higher order representation with a lower order representation embedded within it. So a higher order will be John thinks, and the ball is in the box will be a lower order representation. Okay, John thinks, Sue thinks the ball is in the box. Here simply more layers of representation. So the highest is John thinks. Then within that there is Sue thinks, and still one more representation, the ball is in the box. The term meta-representation can also be found in Grice's approach to communication, because Grice interprets communication in terms of attribution of the speaker's meanings. That is, on the basis of what the speaker said, a particular thought can be attributed to the speaker. So the formation and recognition of communicators' intentions is central. The comprehension process starts from a meta-representation of an attributed utterance and ends with a meta-representation of an attributed thought. So, speaking plainly, we may say that a person wants to communicate something, so entertains a particular thought and then represents this thought in an utterance. So on the basis of this representation, the addressee may derive a conclusion concerning the communicator's intention, so meta-representation of the attributed thought. So first there is a meta-representation of an attributed utterance. We perceive this utterance, we interpret it somehow, and then we attribute a thought to this utterance. Now, if you look at the examples, you're neglecting your job. Mary said you're neglecting your job. Mary said I'm neglecting my job. Mary believes I'm neglecting my job. Mary intends me to believe that I'm neglecting my job. Mary intends me to believe that she intends me to believe that I'm neglecting my job. All these sentences illustrate this specific meta-communicative ability to attribute speaker meanings on the basis of an utterance. So Mary says something like, you are neglecting your job, and you may quote it directly, but you may then interpret it somehow and then say, Mary said I'm neglecting my job, which is still a pretty direct interpretation, but then Mary believes I'm neglecting my job, or Mary intends me to believe that I'm neglecting my job. These are attributions, we may say. So all of these are meta-representations. And finally, the term of meta-representation appears in literature on quotations, because a quotation is a meta-representation, okay? So that is, someone produces an utterance and we meta-represent it, either literally or perhaps interpretively. So utterances about attributed utterances. That is, he said that, okay? So this is a type of meta-representation used not in identifying the speaker's meaning, but as a part of the speaker's meaning. So Peter might report Mary's utterance in one of the following ways. Mary said to me, "You are neglecting your job," which is a direct quotation. Mary told me I was not working hard enough, which is an indirect quotation, but mind you that there are some elements of interpretation in that quotation, in that meta-representation. According to Mary, I'm neglecting my work, so this is a mixed quotation involving both elements of direct and indirect quotation. And then Mary was pretty rude to me, I'm neglecting my job, free indirect quotation. So all these are meta-representations of an original utterance that Mary produced. Both the higher level and the lower level representations are utterances, and both are components of the speaker's meaning. They are part of what Peter intends to communicate. So far we've discussed meta-representations that are attributive. So the concept of attribution appears. It means that you attribute a particular thought to someone. So John thinks that, let's say the mouse is in the box. You attribute a particular thought to John, or you attribute a particular utterance to a speaker. And all these examples involving quotations. So we may say that so far we've discussed attributive representations. So either attributed utterances or attributed thoughts. But there might be some representations in which you cannot find an attribution, so non-attributive representations of a more abstract nature, such as linguistic, logical or conceptual. So dragonflies are beautiful is a sentence of English. What is italicized, this phrase that is italicized, dragonflies are beautiful, is believed to be a pure mention, that is, a pure non-attributive meta-representation. Shut up is rude. Again, shut up is a phrase that is somehow quoted, but it is not attributed to any specific speaker. So it is an abstract meta-representation. It is true that tulips are flowers. So this is again a proposition, okay? So involving some logical conclusion. Roses and daisies are flowers. Entails that roses are flowers. I like the name Petronella. A bay is not a word of English. Tulip implies flower. So here, mind you, the higher order representation is either an utterance or a thought, because I may either say the above or think. And the lower order representation, however, is an abstract representation. It is a sentence type in A, it is an utterance type in B, it is a proposition in C and D, it is a name in E, it is a word in F, and it is a concept in G. So these are cases of pure mention, and this pure mention may be classified as an abstract meta-representation. I just want to draw your attention between this differentiation between mention and use. Mind you that when we speak, we cannot signal, perhaps we can prosodically, but apart from that, there are no signals that make it easier for us to understand whether a particular word is used as referring to the linguistic expression or as referring to the concept in the world. So if I say live, you do not know whether I refer to the word live or whether I refer to the concept as such. So if I say life is hard, then the concept is involved, and this kind is called use. When I say life is a monosyllabic word, then I refer to the linguistic expression, and this is called mention. So these examples of mentions will be now classified as abstract meta-representations. So now we can perhaps present a short summary of various types of meta-representation. The higher order representation is generally an utterance or a thought. And there are three main types of lower order representations. Public, so these are utterances. Mental, these are attributed thoughts. And abstract, so these are sentences and propositions. All varieties of meta-representation can be analyzed in terms of the notion of representation by resemblance. You remember that it is particularly visible in the case of quotations, that a quotation may be direct, may be literal, but more often it is just some kind of an interpretation of what someone has said, so it resembles the original utterance. Now, perhaps we'll try to explain why resemblance and not identity, though it seems to me that we've already mentioned the term several times. So in some literature it has been assumed that identity rather than resemblance is a typical case. Direct quotations are treated as reproductions of the original sentences. Indirect quotations are reproductions of the content. Yet in many cases indirect quotation involves paraphrase, elaboration or exaggeration rather than strict identity of content. So Mary told me I was not working hard enough is just an interpretation of the original sentence. If you still keep it in mind, the original sentence is you're neglecting your job. So this is what Mary said, you're neglecting your job. And if I then present it in the form of Mary told me I was not working hard enough, it is already an interpretation of some kind. Or you may easily imagine that Mary said something like, you spend too much time at the theatre. And obviously, you spend too much time at the theatre contextually implicates that Peter is neglecting his job. And then obviously Peter may derive that conclusion and report this conclusion instead of saying, Mary told me that I spent too much time at the theatre. But besides, even if we do not consider such, let's say, difficult cases, still, if the quotation appears to be direct, then you have to take into account certain phonetic features that cannot be repeated exactly. You have to take into account various hesitations, mispronunciations, repairs. So we have to conclude that in fact you cannot produce an identical representation of what has been said, or at least we can very rarely. Another example on the basis of which you can notice that identity is hardly ever attained. If you look at example A, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. This seems to be a direct quotation, but obviously it is not verbatim because Descartes was French. So here it appears in translation. Now the question arises to what extent this translation can be treated as identical to the original sentence. Now, in the next one, I looked at John and he's like, what are you saying? Then again, this is just your interpretation of the expression at John's face, the way he looks. Okay, so again, we cannot say that for instance, if it is translated from another language, then obviously it cannot be a direct translation, because probably this, what I was saying, will sound different in the original, in the source language. The conclusion is then that a quotation must merely resemble the original to some degree, and obviously this resemblance involves shared properties, and these are perhaps logical properties, implicational properties, but it does not have to be, I mean, the quotation does not have to be a reproduction. Mind you that resemblance involves maybe of any type, so it may be a perceptual resemblance, linguistic resemblance, logical, mathematical, conceptual, sociolinguistic, stylistic, typographic, so you may just, sociolinguistic if you try to imitate someone's accents or way of pronouncing, stylistic if you use particular collocation that are peculiar to a person. So actually there are various types of resemblance, and we are quite used to presenting various phenomena in terms of other phenomena that are similar in one way or another. If you decide to use a direct quotation, if you do not change a single word, so if you say, Mary said to me, you are neglecting your job, then for some reason you believe that the formal aspects are important. So the direct quotation increases the salience of formal and linguistic properties. So we may say that this is a metalinguistic representation. On the other hand, if we interpret the original sentence, and if we say that Mary told me I should work harder, then we simply emphasize the content. So what increases is the salience of semantic and logical properties. So that type of resemblance is called interpretive. That kind of meta-representation is called interpretive meta-representation, or alternatively conceptual meta-representation. So on the other hand, there might be a metalinguistic meta-representation. On the other hand, interpretive or conceptual. Sometimes both elements can be involved. So we might call these resemblances metalinguistic, those in which the formal or linguistic properties are of utmost importance. On the other hand, there are interpretive or conceptual meta-representations in which the contents is more important than the formal features. Mixed quotations involve both metalinguistic and interpretive meta-representations. Now, in the interpretive resemblance, in the interpretive meta-representation, the resemblance obviously involves the content. Thus, the two utterances, the original and the meta-represented, share logical and contextual implications. And then identity can be simply defined as a special case of resemblance in which all implications are shared. Very frequently it is obvious that what follows is a meta-representation. Then it is just an explicit meta-representation. So in other words, there are certain overtly marked quotations, linguistically indicated. So we may just say, Mary said. And then we know that what follows is a meta-representation of what Mary said. Then we may say, Peter thought, and we know that Peter thought prefaces an attributed thought, so the meta-representation of Peter's thought. But it may happen that there are no signal that what follows is a meta-representation, and it is the task of the addressee to infer the implicit character of meta-representation. So in free indirect speech, for instance, the presence, source and type of the meta-representation is left to the reader to infer. So, for instance, Frederick reproached Elizabeth. She had behaved inconsiderately. Now, the question arises here how to interpret the sentence, she had behaved inconsiderately. Three interpretations of that sentence are possible. So it can be an assertion by the narrator, it can be a free indirect report of what Frederick said, and it can be a free indirect report of what Frederick thought. So this is a sentence coming from Jane Austen's Persuasion, and I guess that the most typical interpretation would be the last one, that is a free indirect report of what Frederick thought about Elizabeth. But mind you that it does not have to be so. So as you see, first of all, the presence is obvious, but the source and the type of meta-representation is left to us to infer. So, as the above examples illustrate, linguistic meta-representations may vary from the fully explicit to the fully inferred, that is implicit. Now, most languages have a range of quotative devices that indicate an attributive intention without foregrounding it to the degree shown in Mary said to me. So obviously you may choose to be as explicit as Mary said, Peter thought, but you may use just some other signals for the same purpose. So English has hearsay adverbs such as allegedly or reportedly, or adjectives such as self-confessed or so-called, particles, quote, unquote, parentheticals, such as Chomsky says, according to Grice, and noun phrases, Derrida's claim that, or the suspect's allegation that. In addition, we may also use quotation marks and finger dancing and paralinguistic resources for indicating attributive use. So simply if we use one of these expressions, so not necessarily something as straightforward as Mary said to me, the addressee will know that this is some kind of meta-representation, attributive meta-representation, that it is a quote, for instance, or that it should be attributed to someone else, so that the speaker himself or herself is not the source of what follows. So here are examples of such expressions that signal, first of all, that what follows is a meta-representation, and then they also inform the addressee who or what might be the source of the quotation. So, for instance, allegedly, the health service is on its last legs. So mind you that the utterance is attributed to someone other than the speaker. Or, confidentially, unfortunately, the health service is on its last legs. So here, the expression carries speech, act, or propositional attitude information, and we know, on the basis of use of confidentially, unfortunately, that this is the speaker's own utterance. That actually he is saying that confidentially, or that he believes it is unfortunate. So we know that we simply recognize it as a self-attributive expression, confidentially or unfortunately. Then there will be riots, the security forces warn us. Again, mind you that the utterance is attributed to someone other than the speaker. There will be riots, I warn you. So here it is the speaker himself who is the source of the utterance. There will be riots, I fear. Okay, so again, on the basis of these expressions, you can decide whether that is, you can identify the source of the information. Into this category of epistemic or illocutionary expressions fall mood indicators, declarative and imperative, evidential, such as doubtless, attitudinal particles such as alas, and indicators of illocutionary force like please, for instance. So on the basis of these expressions you can decide whether the utterance is attributed to someone else or whether it is self-attributive expression. Perhaps you remember we discussed free indirect speech, and in free indirect speech it is the audience, it is the hearer that has to decide, that has to identify this free indirect speech as an attributed meta-representation, that is, must recognize it as a quotation that is attributed to someone, to Frederick, for instance. But we can also notice the same process in some other forms, not necessarily quotations. So higher order meta-representations in general need not be linguistically marked. So could you now compare such two sentences? The grass is wet because it is raining. So it is a purely descriptive claim. In other words, you simply describe the state of affairs in the world. But then if you say it is raining because the grass is wet, it is a different sentence. Actually, yeah, it is a different sentence because it represents the speaker's belief. So it is not the description of the state of affairs, but it is just a speaker's belief. The speaker derives a conclusion on the basis of what he has noticed. So in the first sentence, in sentence A, the causal relation between two states of affairs holds, but in sentence B, it is this relation holds between a state of affairs and an utterance or a thought. So in fact, to understand sentence B, the hearer must construct a higher order representation, such as she says, or he says, or she thinks, or he thinks that the grass, that it must have been raining because the grass is wet. So on the basis of the observation that the grass is wet, the speaker has constructed, has derived a conclusion, and now produces her or his belief. So this is a higher order representation, and to understand this sentence you construct it in your mind. Another example in which this higher level representation has to be constructed, and in fact is the only relevant interpretation of the sentence, is something like, your name is Deirdre Wilson. So the situation is that someone approaches Deirdre Wilson and says, your name is Deirdre Wilson. Obviously, for Deirdre Wilson, who is Deirdre Wilson, the information is irrelevant. But what the speaker wants to communicate is that she knows or believes that the addressee's name is Deirdre Wilson. So it might be, flattering for Deirdre Wilson to be recognized. But anyway, this is not the content, that is the base level explicature that counts here, but this higher level representation that I recognize it, I think you must be Deirdre Wilson. Okay, so again, to understand it, to make sense out of this sentence, you have to construct this higher level, higher order representation. In some cases, what has to be pragmatically resolved is whether some higher order information made manifest by the utterance is part of the speaker's meaning or merely accidentally transmitted. Mary, I'm about to resign. So Mary is whispering, and now the question is whether her whispering, it's obviously intentional and it's obviously made manifest, but then the problem is whether we should construct a higher order meta-representation of that, or whether it is just the problem that Mary has with her throat today. So it is then accidentally transmitted. Or Mary frowning, you are late. or Mary puzzled, the radio is not working. So here, as you can see, the paralinguistic features may provide a clue to Mary's attitude to the proposition. And these paralinguistic features may provide a clue to whether Mary intended to convey some additional message concerning her attitude, or whether it was just accidentally transmitted. But sometimes this attitude, if it is intended to be communicated, can be communicated in a linguistic form. So reports may achieve relevance by informing the hearer about the content of the original, but there are also cases which achieve relevance mainly by conveying the speaker's attitude to an attributed utterance or thought. So you remember, because this is similar in a way to the sentence we've just discussed, your name is Deirdre Wilson. This sentence is not relevant, it does not achieve relevance by conveying the content, by informing the addressee about something, but it achieves relevance by conveying the speaker's belief. And now we will discuss the cases in which it is important for the addressee to understand the speaker's attitude, to pick up the speaker's attitude. And what makes it possible to convey a particular attitude to the utterance quoted is the so-called echoic use, which is a subcategory of interpretive use, and it seems to me that we mentioned the term already. So the attitude can be conveyed when the speaker uses a quoted utterance or an attributed thought, so-called echoically. There are three types of attitude. So we'll start from utterances, and then perhaps we will proceed to the discussion of attributed thoughts, but we'll start from utterances. And the point here is that the utterance is echoically used. So there's three types of attitude: the attitude of endorsement, the attitude of bewilderment, and the attitude of dissociation or rejection. So Peter says, that was a fantastic film, and Mary is sharing his view and says, fantastic, yes, indeed, it was fantastic. So then this repetition of the exact term that Peter used, so the echoic repetition, is the source of expressing the attitude of endorsement. Here perhaps the effect does not strike you as very different from the one that can be achieved when Mary just says fantastic on her own. That is, if it is her own assertion and not just the echoic sentence. But perhaps you can notice the difference. You can notice this, the echoic use as expressing the attitude in further examples. So that was a fantastic film. Fantastic? So Mary is puzzled. So this is the attitude of bewilderment. And perhaps Mary does not share the view, so that's why she says fantastic. And now obviously the repetition, the exact repetition of the word is important here. So it is deliberate. And then the last example, that was a fantastic film. Fantastic indeed. So here it is full of scorn. I mean, this expression, fantastic, and obviously what we know is that Mary does not show the view at all, that she thinks quite the opposite. So this is the attitude of dissociation. Now, mind you that, like regular quotations, echoic utterances may be metalinguistic or interpretive. The attitude expressed may be to the form of the original or to its content. The attitude may be marked overtly or left to inference. So, if it is the echoic utterance of metalinguistic character, we are, for instance, surprised by someone's pronunciation, and we say, tomato? Since when have you been eating tomatoes? Here we eat tomatoes. Okay, so tomatoes, that will be the attitude of bewilderment, of metalinguistic character, because what you question, what you're distrustful about, are just formal features. But it may as well be the content, as in the example above. Fantastic, so here simply you question the accuracy of the description. And now, the attitude may be marked overtly or left to inference. So, for instance, if in the examples above, where it is fantastic, okay, with perhaps a slightly sarcastic tone of voice, then this attitude has to be inferred. That it is the view that merit is not shared. Now, some attitudinal devices can be used to make it easier for the addressee to identify this attitude. So, creedal devices like he knows, he admits, as Chomsky says, as the arguments have shown. Questioning attitudes, right, aren't you? Dissociative attitudes. You're bound to win, I don't think. You're going to run the marathon. Ha! So, mind you that the main clause here is attributive. What is meant by that? You're bound to win. This is the thought or the utterance attributed to the addressee. And then what follows is my comment. I don't think. Or, you're going to run the marathon. Ha! So this ha is highly sarcastic, so it casts doubts on the previous utterance. Again, the previous utterance is attributive, it is attributed to the addressee, and then what follows is some kind of implicit comment on the plausibility of the endeavor. Irony consists in echoing a tacitly attributed thought or utterance with a tacitly dissociative attitude. So what is meant by that? It is, if someone uses a particular utterance, like it is a lovely day for a picnic, and you just repeat it, then the attitude of dissociation is tacit, that is, the addressee has to infer the attitude of rejection. The addressee has to infer that you are pretty critical about that. Now, if it is an attributed thought, then obviously, since it is attributed, you do not know whether a person shares the thought or indeed. So that's why we say it is tacitly attributed thought. Okay, so first of all, you have to identify a particular utterance as representing a tacitly attributed thought, and then, additionally, you have to identify the attitude of rejection. Verbal irony is interpretive, okay? It may involve loose resemblance. So far, I believe we've discussed examples such as, it is a lovely day for a picnic. Yes, indeed, it is a lovely day for a picnic. Or, it was a fantastic film. Yes, indeed, fantastic. So here, we just repeated exactly the words. But mind you, if you look at this example, I'm Prince Charles, and I'm the Queen of Sheba. Okay, so if someone says, I'm Prince Charles, and I'm the Queen of Sheba, so here, as you can see, the repetition is not exact. She does not repeat, I'm Prince Charles too, or anything like that. But it consists in echoic allusion. What is shared here is the obvious falsehood or absurdity. So, verbal irony is interpretive, because you interpret what someone has said. Parody, on the other hand, may be treated as purely metalinguistic, because in parody the formal features are mocked at. Now, metarepresentation is referred to, is a key concept, not only in the analysis of irony, in the analysis of implicit attitude of dissociation, but is also used in the analysis of metalinguistic negation and in the analysis of echo questions. So we'll discuss these two topics in details, but I just want you to know what metalinguistic is. So if you look at the next example, I'm not happy, I'm elated. So you can notice that it is a different kind of negation that is truth conditional or descriptive. So if I say I'm not happy, it means I'm unhappy, okay? But here the speaker does not say that he is unhappy or she is unhappy, but that she is more than happy. So we can say that this is a different kind of negation than descriptive negation, that is truth conditional negation, that is governed by the negative operator, logical operator of negation. Now, it is called metalinguistic because a particular aspect of a sentence, a particular linguistic aspect is negated, not the content, not the truth conditional content, but a selected aspect. And here it is the word happy. It is not strong enough to express the type of happiness I experience. Okay. If you look at the next sentence, which is similar, he's not tall, he's a giant. So if we say he is not tall, we expect he's short. Okay, but it is not, again, an example of the truth conditional negation. We just negate, again, a particular aspect of that utterance, that is the degree of height, if I may say so. So tall is not enough. He's a giant. He's huge. So that type of negation is called metalinguistic, and there is a problem what to do with that kind of negation, whether it should be singled out as a separate category that has nothing in common with truth conditional negation. And it seems that the concept of meta-representation helps to solve the problem. And the next area of interest for us are echo questions. So let me just illustrate what an echo question is. Don't touch my agapanthus. Don't touch your agapanthus? So this is, again, as you can see, an echoic repetition of the question. The problem here is whether that type of question should be, again, the type of questions should be, again, singled out as a separate category, independent of all the remaining interrogative structures, or perhaps this concept of meta-representation will allow us to present a uniform analysis of interrogations. So that's it for now, and our next lecture will be devoted to echoic questions. Thank you for your attention.